I think the powerfulness is that it actually is centered around some core principles and values for building together, learning how to govern together, learning how to steward a set of resources together, and then being in relationship with one another. How do we reconcile the world that we're trying to build with the conditions that we're in?
Hey everyone, it's Hildy, and this is the Creating the Future podcast. I'm glad you've joined us here today. This is a place for us to explore what really creates social change. What will actually create the healthy, joyful future we all want to live in? I'm so happy that Dana Kawaoka-Chen is joining us on the podcast today. Dana is the co-executive director at Justice Funders, a partner and guide for philanthropy in reimagining practices that advance a thriving and just world. As founding executive director of Justice Funders, Dana grew the organization by aligning its strategy to the visions of movements working for racial, economic, and social justice. Dana also co-authored The Choir Book, a framework for social justice philanthropy, and was a primary contributor to Resonance, a framework for philanthropic transformation. Given her experience in helping individuals and organizations transition to create a more just and equitable world, it is my joy to welcome Dana to the podcast today. Welcome to the podcast, Dana. It is such a pleasure to have you. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
I am so glad to be in conversation with you, Hildy.
Could you start out by just sharing a little bit with our listeners? What is the path in your life that has led you to be so passionate, and you are so passionate about social justice? What is it in your life that has led you to this point?
Well, I would say for me, there was this moment that I had. I'm born and raised in California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when I was in 8th grade, my district issued textbook said in the chapter on World War II that Japanese Americans were interned for their safety. And as a 4th generation Japanese American whose paternal family was all incarcerated, my dad was actually born behind barbed wire. That was a moment of personal reckoning with the fact that, I know this is not true. And I think at that point in my life, I had essentially grown up with some sense that what is printed, especially in a school, would be true. So there was a reckoning with okay, whose history is really being told here? How is this narrative, what is being taught as U.S. history? What is it that I know to be different, and what am I going to do about it? So obviously I'm glossing over a lot of emotional angst that came with this
Sure. Oh my goodness.
process, but I think it was the first moment, if you're a Spider-Man fan and you can recall that moment where Uncle Ben tells Peter Parker, right, with great power comes great responsibility. It was kind of for me, the power of knowledge was how I interpreted what this moment was for me, that I knew something that countered what was presented. And so I actually took it upon myself to go talk with my teacher. And I think in a very generous moment of recognizing that there was an opportunity for this student to exercise her leadership, but also for an opportunity for the class to have a firsthand example, she gave me the entire class one day to actually share my family's experience and to lead the lesson on World War II and specifically what happened to Japanese Americans as a counterpoint to what we had read. And so that not only set me personally on a path of being more critical of what my own educational experience was, but it made me more starkly aware of how injustice is perpetuated. And it gave me that sort of starting moment of what are you going to do about it?
That is such a boost to any young person. Not just the aha, not just the seeing it, but that teacher actually being a teacher and bringing out not only another side of the story, but bringing out the best in you. That's pretty incredible.
When I look back on it, it really was an incredible moment.
Yeah.
And so when you ask, how did I get to where I am? I think it started there. And I would say two other moments stand out as sort of those pivotal moments where right after college, I went to UC Santa Cruz, and I think I spent more time organizing maybe than in the classroom. And so I came out and I actually took a role as an electoral organizer. And so you're door knocking and you're phone banking, and in either case, you're leading with the moral vision. Either this is how good things could be, and I need you to vote this way on this day, or this is how messed up things are, and I need you to vote this way on this day. And from that learning, I think the rest of my early career was spent really grounded in this moral vision. And once I got to an organization in which I was promoted through the ranks and became executive director, I learned really quickly, right, that sometimes in organizations where we're all aligned on what the larger goal is, that it's not necessarily enough on the day-to-day level to have some of the inconsistencies of what living in systems that are oppressive are, what they look like or what they mean in practice for values-aligned organizations and how to work within them. And so that discrepancy, that contradiction, is what led me to pursue a master's in organization development. And I think the key out of that experience can be distilled down into this behavioral psychology point of view, which is that folks are going to be preconditioned against change for whatever reason. It could be that I don't know what that looks like, so that's scary to me and I'm going to say no. Or I am just going to say no because anything that's different is something that I can't imagine. And so behavioral psychologists say within change management, you make that change and then the attitudinal and behavioral change follows, which in some ways is antithetical to what I had learned as an electoral organizer. And so really, it wasn't until I got this role at what was then the Bay Area Justice Funders Network, which is the precursor to Justice Funders where I'm currently at. I'll say that being hired to lead a brand new organization was kind of like winning a professional lottery.
Yeah.
I was given the opportunity to build a new organization from the ground up and make it into what I thought it could be, the potential for what that was. But I think unlike an actual lottery where there's an obvious award, what have I experienced in both the 8th grade and then in this moment in being hired to lead this brand new organization is that I had to, as an individual, be willing to see the opportunity. I also had to be willing to seize the opportunity. I feel like you know something about this, right, Hildy? I feel like you call this catalytic thinking.
It is ringing way too many bells as somebody who has founded 3 nonprofits and 2 for-profit businesses. Absolutely. They're seeing it, and so many people see it and don't seize it. And for those of us who have a problem with constantly founding organizations, we're unfortunately very predisposed to seizing it. Can you talk a little bit, Dana, about what Justice Funders is?
Sure. Justice Funders is a partner and guide for philanthropy to reimagine its role, its work, what it does in the world. Through that, we both offer opportunities for funders to reimagine practices that will facilitate a just transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And I think in a lot of ways, when you asked, how did I get here? Or what was it along the way? I would also answer that question as a practitioner. When I said it was like winning a professional lottery, it was the opportunity for me to create the very systems that I struggled with as a young ED earlier in my career. It was the opportunity for me to set up the systems and culture that I felt was more aligned to the vision that I had for what we need to transform in the world. And it was also an opportunity for us to experiment with the very practices that we're now asking philanthropy to adopt. And so in terms of thinking about both how I got here, but also what this project is, this project, yes, has this external purpose and it has this work that it does in the field. And at the same time, it has also been an important sandbox, if you will, for us to try to figure out how do you make organizational systems, especially in the construct of capitalism, less extractive? How do you, when you have bylaws that are accredited with the state of California, be an employer that supports the workers and is not necessarily trying to enforce compliance? How do you create the kind of culture and well-being in a workplace that also has the value of democracy and yet operate within the other rules and regulations that we have that govern 501c3 organizations? And so
that place of having a sandbox is just, it's what creating the future has been since the beginning. And there's something, we've always talked about our work as being an experiment, that we are experimenting in demonstration projects with others, but we're demonstrating ourselves. We're experimenting on ourselves. What does it look like if a board is not the way you've always pictured it? What does it look like if funding is not the way you've always pictured it? And one of the things that we realized early on is that we don't really value that in the world. I mean, we value founders and innovators, but in the world of philanthropy, in the world of nonprofits, to say our job is just to experiment and figure things out, there's really not a category for that. There's no, when you go into those drop down menus, there's no checklist for that. There's no checkbox. So I'm really, really excited to hear, because it's all about learning. It basically becomes about learning. And I love that question of what does it take to align with values when the systems you have to operate within don't align with those values?
Right. Yeah.
Well, you have led me right into the question at the heart of this podcast, which is, when you see change happening out in the world, what are the factors that you see undergirding that change? You have promulgated so many incredible things at Justice Funders and all of your learning prior to that. What is it that actually, in your experience, creates change?
So deceptive, this question. It is both at the same time very simple in what you are asking, and yet I think for me requires a little bit of context in order to say what factors I actually think create change. One factor, I think, is less recognized in this moment. A lot of folks talk about leadership, and the emphasis is always on the leader or the leaders. And less time and attention is often paid to the followers. And the fact that for any one of us to be a leader, we actually have to have followers. And so both there is an act of being deliberate in choosing to follow, and there is, I think, when we think about the greater change that's happening in the world, an an intention of organizations also following, that not everyone can always be at the front, that you have to have different people and different organizations flanking you, that the conditions that we're in, the systems that we're trying to change are so much bigger than any one person or any one organization. And so it's going to take actually disciplined practice for many of us in order to follow a set of visions and leaders that may actually not be within our own organizations, and to be fine with that.
That alone is a big one. Because again, in the systems we operate in, you are rewarded for leading. You are rewarded for being the innovator. And I'm recalling years ago, I did a talk for a group of community foundation leaders via the Council on Foundations. And we were talking about community engagement and what does it really look like as a community foundation to be about community and all coming together. And the question that these community foundation leaders wanted answered over and over and over again was, yeah, but how do we attribute that work to us?
Right.
And you're talking about just the opposite of that.
Right. I mean, I think that's the insidiousness of philanthropy, right? It's that there is, with this great power and wealth accumulated within organizations, to create theories of change that prove how uniqueness is going to be solved by these individual organizations and not actually through a broader array of work that's happening across a community, of which many of our foundations are a part of, but that all of their, theories of change are trying to assert that they alone are going to somehow ameliorate poverty or ameliorate the problems that come with economic injustice. Yeah.
So you mentioned that there were several factors. What else are you thinking about?
For me, it comes to something that I've heard educator and writer Walida Imarisha say, that we can't build what we can't imagine. And one of the things that I think is really hard and harkens back to the personal dilemma I was facing both in the earlier stages of my career as both then a young electoral organizer who then went to essentially business school, is that the change management part is just what that is. It's managing people within a change process. But what we're changing to sometimes is also the difficult part for organizations who are wanting something different other than the status quo. So we know more about, I don't want that, or I don't like that, but are unable to name, so what is that vision for us about what would lead us into a world in which people and planet can thrive? And so for me, I think a lot of where I try to both ground my own practice in thinking about the future and in trying to support philanthropy to imagine a different future than the present that we are in, is to think about what are our current movement organizations doing and teaching us about the future? And what kinds of work does our ancestral knowledge offer to us about other ways in which we can be together? And so for me personally, in 2015, I was very fortunate to be invited to attend a Just Transition retreat that was hosted by the organization Movement Generation. Movement Generation and Climate Justice Alliance, in the last couple of years preceding this retreat, had developed a strategic framework that they called the Just Transition. And what this framework outlined is that in the current extractive economy, the predominant worldview is one that is a colonial mindset, right? That celebrates consumerism. And in this worldview, right, Resources are extracted by digging, burning, dumping. Workers are exploited with the purpose of enclosing wealth and power for a few. And in this system, then, militarism is the way that governance takes place. What I love about this framework is because it doesn't just stop with naming what the current conditions are. It talks about how to facilitate then a just transition into a more regenerative economy. We need to stop the bad and divest from the system. We need to change the rules and build the new. And that the regenerative economy needs to actually be guided from a worldview of caring and sacredness, where resources are regenerated, work is done in cooperation for the purpose of ecological and social well-being, right? So completely different underpinning of the system and governed by deep democracy. And so what resonated with me is that this is the vision for what we're collectively trying to build. And so how does our collective imagination that we are helping to socialize, that we are helping to support others in also imagining for their organizations and communities, reflect the values and principles outlined in this framework?
Have you seen groups that have worked with that framework, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
Can you share a story?
Yeah. One of the beautiful things that I think I have observed in watching groups who have applied the just transition across the country is that it's the vision, values, and practice alignment rather than a widget format, if you will. Much of what the Industrial Revolution, much of how I think capitalism and the early day factories of the US conditioned many of us to think about what scale looks like is the production of a similar thing, the creation of similar kinds of organizations that would be all over the place and would all be able to then handle supporting, serving, or producing X number of things, but they would all be the same. But we know from our lived experience that that's not actually how many of us exist in the world. All of our communities have a different context. All of our cultural backgrounds and experiences actually lend to working with each other and understanding the world differently. So the same widget, the same service is not going to work for everyone. And so when I have gone to different communities, what I have appreciated is actually seeing the values of deep democracy, of collectivity, of maintaining the resources that our labor in this community produces in this community. So sometimes I think that looks like Boston. I think about the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative and their land trust that they've created. I think about how in this land trust that's now been around for several decades, that they've not only taken housing off the speculative market and created 100-year leases that allow multiple generations of family members to stay in housing that is maintained for the community. I look at the ways in which they've supported a community garden that has allowed multiple small businesses to emerge, whether or not it's actual businesses growing food and flowers that are sold into local restaurants and shops, or the ways in which those local restaurants and shops bring their compost back to the community garden and start that regenerative process. And that through those processes, we also can see the ways in which labor is treated differently. And that through cooperative businesses owned by, for instance, returning citizens, folks are not only able to have a share of what their labor produces, but that also those resources are kept within the community.
And the people connect. It's beyond the stuff. It's beyond the housing and the garden. It's the connecting of the people there.
Yeah. That they see each other as a community whose fates are interdependent. Most definitely.
Very
Yeah.
much so.
And that looks very different than when you are in a tribal community who has a different orientation already to the earth and to the natural environment, and who have now imagined how to take their indigenous practices of care and stewardship into broader based community initiatives that both are supporting housing, employment, the reclamation of language, and looking at those projects as parts of projects that are collectively stewarded by members of the tribal community that have relationship with both their own cultural practice, but also ones in which also employ members of the community. All of these decision-making processes being co-governed together. So there are multiple ways I think that just transition has begun to flourish in different places. And I think the powerfulness is not that it looks the same, but that it actually is centered around some core principles and values for building together, learning how to govern together, learning how to steward a set of resources together. And then, as you named, being in relationship with one another.
We talk often at Creating the Future about the fact that the doing is not replicable because, as you said, every community is different. I mean, even in one city, every neighborhood is different. The doing isn't replicable, but the thinking is. The questions, the values, the thinking is replicable. And then every community can do that how it makes sense for them. I love your focus on imagining. It was interesting during COVID, and I actually was just writing about this morning. During COVID, horrible things happened. Many people died. Many people were dealing with loneliness and alienation. It was a really difficult time. But there were also some pretty cool things that happened. And people spending time with their families, people going for walks. You walked around the neighborhood and suddenly you saw everybody was out. And there were many aspects of what we lived in during lockdown that people were saying, we can't go back to what it was. We have changed. We have seen something different. We have seen a different way of being. Unfortunately, it took something catastrophic for us to see this, but we can't go back.
Yeah.
And the minute lockdown was over, we went back. And the reason we went back is because we didn't have a mutually aligned vision of what to go to. We had what we didn't like. We didn't have systems in place to help us with what to go to. And what you're sharing with Just Transitions and other stories is we needed those examples. We need to be able to see, oh, there is an alternative I can go to. And that's really powerful. Are you working with that at Justice Funders? Are you trying to share those kinds of different ways of being?
Yes. As I mentioned, part of our attempt at not only being in integrity as a practitioner with what we ask philanthropy to do, it is also for us to figure out, okay, so how do we reconcile the world that we're trying to build with the conditions that we're in? And so in 2021, we decided to move from being a fiscally sponsored organization to becoming an independent 501c3. But in that process, we decided that the design of the 501c3 would be that of a worker self-directed nonprofit. And so,
what does that mean? Explain that.
In a traditional 501c3 organization, a traditional nonprofit, it's very much modeled off a corporate structure in which there is an organization of staff that reports to a board of directors, and the board of directors ultimately is the decision maker for much of the organization. One of the things that we learn as part of embracing a just transition is the notion that if we are prepared to actually facilitate this just transition, if we're prepared to win this, we also have to be prepared to govern. And I think that in an organization model where we are experiencing very few opportunities for us to actually practice governance together, it also just reinforces the same dynamic that I think ultimately many of us experience as oppressive. And so in a worker self-directed nonprofit organization, the board consciously cedes its power through a resolution to its staff and says, staff, you are ultimately the decision makers of this organization. And so it is up to you to create the governing structures for how you will make decisions that are otherwise centralized at the board level. And so part of what we have been learning and practicing and trying to figure out together in the last 4 years has very much been centered around how do we co-govern an organization together? And what does that look like? What are the additional practices that many of us never learned because we grew up in very traditional hierarchical organizations? What do we need to create that would actually facilitate the kind of process in which multiple ones of us are now in charge of stewarding a process from everything from creating the organizational policies for staff, from being able to determine the benefit plan, the salary scale, the budget, the program priorities, the vendors we're using, the retirement plan we're going to go with, right? All of that becomes then multiple opportunities for us to practice together. How do we assess what we should do? And then once that assessment is done, how do we decide what we should do? And then how do we as a group implement this new process, policy, or program? And so I think very much in the doing of trying to figure these things out, we have also had multiple opportunities for us to learn and to get better at being able to navigate some of the contradictions that exist, that are enforced through the outside world, and determine what of these things are actually rules and regulations that we need to follow, or what have been, for instance, the cultural practice that has just been adopted through having institutions like ours in relationship to philanthropy for the last 100 years.
I feel like we have been on very, very similar paths. I'm smiling at how much of this do we really have to do? And I'll share a story with you that I think you're going to appreciate. We spent a long time talking about governance, even when we first started as Creating the Future, which we brought our first board together in 2011. So we're about the same age as you all. We just did it a little differently. Our very first board, I remember them saying, we need to not call ourselves a board. We're a group of leaders desperately trying not to be a board.
Mm-hmm.
So that from the start. And we spent several years trying to determine what is the most effective way for an organization to accomplish, what does an organization make possible? And what is the most effective way for an organization to run? And it became very, very clear that decisions needed to be made by the people closest to the decision. And as we finally got through, what does that mean our board will do? Because legally we needed to have a board. And again, working within the constructs, what do you do that models the values that you want to walk the talk of? We needed to redo our bylaws. And we had always from the beginning just said, we'll put boilerplate bylaws in place and we'll figure it out. And we finally had the stuff. We finally knew what we wanted to put in the bylaws. And to your point of how much of this do we really need to do? We sat down with our attorney because we wanted to make sure that we were legally compliant.
Right.
And we said, if we look at all of the stuff that's in, and we sat down with, we're incorporated in Arizona. So we sat down with the Arizona statutes and we noticed, we said to our attorney, it looks like everything in our bylaws is just cutting and pasting the statutes. And the more I've talked to people from all over, and not just the US, but Canada as well and other countries, it's pretty normal for bylaws to just cut and paste the statutes. Yeah. And I remember saying to our attorney, and there was a couple of us board members saying, so if we just had a link in our bylaws that said anything that is not covered in these bylaws is covered in the statutes, and here's the link to it. She said, well, then people would have to go to the statute. I'm like, so they go to the statute. It was so absurd to realize that bylaws they're not personal to the organization. Right. They're not talking about how do we make decisions. Right. They're going down the road of here's how many board members we'll have and here's how many. How did you get to that decision? It just so resonated with me when you said, how much of this do we really need to do? We cut out literally all of our bylaws and started over again because it was all in the statutes.
Yep.
And of course, how do bylaws get to a new organization? You copy and paste from an old organization. So as you've been noting, we just keep perpetuating that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm very, very curious about the work that Justice Funders is doing. Are you seeing things start to shift? Do you have groups that you've worked with that you can share just a little bit about how you're seeing some shifts in philanthropy that aim more towards justice?
Yeah. One of the things that I think is important to name about what underpins our work, but also I think has been a very important, but maybe not overtly named thread in our conversation, is that transformation usually needs to include transformation at the individual level before it can go to the organizational or institutional level, and then before it can go into a broader field. And I'm naming that to say that one of the core designs of how Justice Funders does our work is to support individuals in the field, usually first, and that there are ways in which we support organizations, but that we recognize that in situations where there is both a status quo, a predisposition to attachment of how systems are, in order to see transformation, we really need not only an individual commitment, but an individual commitment from the leadership of the organization in order for that institution to be able to change. And so I'm saying that to say that a lot of our work then is creating communities of practice, creating leadership programs in which individuals can be on a journey to really explore what is it about the philanthropic practice, whether you're at a program officer level, whether or not you're at an executive level, whether or not you're the person who is on the finance committee, maybe you're on a board chair, to really then examine how could we be doing our work differently? What is the purpose of this organization? And if we believe that our values, which are usually expressed in the 5% of the grant making that the organization does, but not necessarily expressed in the 95% of the organization's assets that are invested, that we need to create better alignment, then there's opportunity for us to support them in creating more alignment. So that's, I think, a general acknowledgement that, one, we're talking about long-term change. We're talking about multiple people in one organization. We're talking about shifts that look like policy decisions that may not be as glamorous, but are resulting in moving money, moving resources differently. We're talking about even the purpose of the organization changing. So a couple of examples I can share are several years ago, we had a program officer who attended one of our leadership development programs for program officers. They were introduced to the Just Transition framework. It really resonated with their values personally. And they thought about the contradictions that they experienced in the organization that they were working with, and how from the value place of being aligned with a just transition and being able to change their portfolio to reflect how to give less extractively, how to give in alignment with movements, they realized that actually there was more that their organization could do. So fast forward, this person is promoted and becomes the executive director of this organization. And in that role, sees the opportunity to bring their board chair into conversations about how the organization could actually make different decisions about the investments of the philanthropy. And so then being in a community of practice with their peers, other private philanthropies who have talked about what the value to alignment practice is for them in relationship to their investments and their grant making and how that is managed through the organization. Not only did they start learning a lot more, but work to change their investment policies, work to make different investments, are now considering looking at what the long-term purpose of their organization is. And so one of the things that we also support philanthropies with is exploring whether or not spend out is an option for their organization instead of, I think, the default being existing in perpetuity.
Yeah. Yeah. These are
And
huge topics. These are huge. These are the kinds of things that are being talked about at the meta level. And you all are really bringing that down to the individual practitioner who is actually going to have to talk to their board about this.
right.
And actually going to have to change where other foundations in the community are not changing. And being that first one is scary. And you're really talking about what that means at a personal level.
Yeah. Because ultimately, for a family member who may have inherited grandpa's resources, it's a tremendous weight of responsibility, not only to the family, but also in some ways to one's identity. And so if we don't also support the individuals in these roles with thinking about, okay, what is it that I can do from my perch, whether that be at the program level or at the board level, we don't receive the kind of transformation that I think we're talking about here, where we can actually redefine or rewrite the bylaws, rewrite the investment policy statement to be able to transform not only this organization, but to facilitate a sea change at the field level.
You're really talking about rewriting the story of philanthropy, of the next chapter.
That's the hope.
Pretty exciting. Pretty exciting. If you had one, and I wish we had like another 2 hours to talk, if you had a couple things or one thing that you would hope our listeners could take away and put into practice, something that they can do to get started, what would you suggest?
I would suggest finding a political home or political homes to join or belong to. The systems and structures that require transformation are larger than any one person or organization. They require us to be in beloved community with one another, to work together from a place of shared vision and values in coordinated collective action. And so I think being a part of a political home not only allows one to deepen the analysis that we have about any of the current conditions that we're operating within, it also gives us the opportunity to engage in collective action with others.
When you say political home, are you talking about electoral politics, or are you talking about, it could be a food bank? Where are you?
My colleague, Mario Lugai at Justice Funders, runs a program called Movement Commons. And the premise of that program is that in the professionalization of the nonprofit sector away from movement building, what we've done is we have lost the art of how to actually all work together to develop the civic identity, the civic journey, and the shared civic work of being in the commons. And so the commons itself is not necessarily a political stance or ideology. It's the idea that there is shared work and shared ways that communities need to be together in the commons. And when I say political home, perhaps this comes more out of organizations who are more traditionally doing community organizing. But the practice that I think I'm referring to and that you're asking about is the practice of being in a collective with other people around issues that you care about so that you can both learn together what the ideology is behind whatever the issue is, but also through that collective nature of being together in community together, you also come through with what is the coordinated response that we need to have together. And that, I think, is what I think more of us need to be in the practice of in this moment.
I think in this moment in particular, we really need to be with each other and to be feeling like we can accomplish something. These are such frustrating times right now, and feeling that we can accomplish something and that the only way we can do that is with each other. It's really, really powerful. Dana, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience and your heart with us today. And I hope you'll come back and we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
I would love to. Thank you, Hildy.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to Dana for sharing her observations and experience with us. I love so many aspects of what Dana talked about. You know, we tend to toss around words like vision and values, but Dana's emphasis is on aligning our actions and plans with that vision and those values. And that alignment is so key to creating a more just and equitable world. We talk about values, but do we mindfully work to model our values in everything we do? And when we focus on vision, are we seeing that vision as an achievable goal that we'll work towards, or as a pipe dream, something to fantasize about at the beginning of a planning session, but then ignoring that vision in our actual planning? When we see our vision as attainable, the work changes. And when we see a big part of our job as not just doing the work, but modeling what that work can look like when every bit of it is walking the talk of our values, that's when our magic can happen. That's when we're shifting behaviors to be the change we want to see in the world. You can learn more about Dana and her work at the podcast page for this episode. And if this episode got you thinking, we hope you'll share this podcast with your friends and colleagues and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious about the work we're doing at Creating the Future, we encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. Every week, we share practice exercises to help you put a toe in to shifting your own work simply by changing the questions you ask. You can find that newsletter and a ton of other resources at creatingthefuture.org. Thank you for being with us today and for wanting to create a better future for our world. We'll see you next time here at Creating the Future.